Okay, could you give me a moment, please? Oke. Bu Laila, bisa ini teman-teman yang lain bisa dikerahkan lagi, Bu, mungkin.
Okay. I think it is better Charlotte can have inspiration, stimulation to our students about how far they have got, they have understood discourse analysis. What they know is about how to choose the text and then make the observation and analysis based on the available theory, such as textuality, such as cohesion, coherence. Under textuality, there are 7 criteria, and then pragmatic. So based on this theory, they are going to make CTA, yeah, critical discourse analysis. They are going to make the analysis of the text they are chosen by themselves. And then within the process of making analysis, I hope my students, and I have done it, they are consulting, they are consulting to me about everything they don't know yet. So that mostly the process of course on discourse analysis here on writing. And today, I'm sorry, I haven't talked yet to my student that they have to enhance their speaking and performing what the idea is. So that Charlotte you can ask my student about what the topic they have work, they have written in a publication in an article, and then Charlotte can have refined or can have help assistant to the student's idea. Okay, Charlotte can make introduction first to my student, and then we are going to help my student to lead to this discussion. Please, Charlotte.
Okay. Wait a minute, Bu Laila, let me start by myself, because I'm going to start this. Let me help you. Maybe I'm not going to say that I'm going to be the moderator, but I'll be here all the time during your presentation or discussion. So anytime you need some help, you need some to the students, I will be here and I will be ready for you to help. But by the way, before we start, let me confirm, Charlotte, will you do the presentation, the share screen by yourself, or you need any help?
No, I'm happy to share the screen by myself. So I've prepared a session talking about one aspect of discourse analysis, and I prepared 3 sessions like this. If you want to change that round to make it more that I talk to the students about their projects, I'm happy to do that later on, but we could start with what I've prepared, and then if you want to change the format, just let me know after.
Okay, no problem. We can do, we can start with the material that you have prepared. We are going to follow the material. Maybe if we need some kind of additional material or revision, not revision by the way, but some kind of requests about the topics or something, maybe we can do that for the next meeting, right? Is that okay, Bu Laila?
Okay. Yes.
Is that okay? Adik-adik, anyone, please? We are going to start. Okay, let me start now. Is that okay, Charlotte, Bu Laila, and the adik-adik semuanya? Adik-adik, can you hear my voice? Guys, students, can you hear my voice?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Motion, always give response to anything expected.
Okay, and the other student, maybe please you may turn on the camera and microphone in case is there anything that you want to discuss, want to share with Charlotte, with Bu Laila, with me. Maybe we can do that during this 90 minutes to go there. It will be a good opportunity for us. Okay, let me start now. Okay, wait a minute. Let me start with our way, right? Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin, wassalatu wassalamu ala asrofil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in, amma ba'du. Well, thank you so much for coming, Dr. Taylor, or here I can call you Charlotte, for today's agenda for visiting program. in our visiting professor program in our study program, English Education Department, Universitas Muhammadiyah Surakarta. It's really a great honor for us to have you here for today. And we hope that for today, we are going to have the experience. We will get some knowledge, some insight from you regarding to the matter of the discourse analysis. And also for Bu Laila, thank you so much for coming as one of the lecturer was that in charge of the course of discourse analysis. So I hope that this is going to be the good collaboration between Bu Laila and also, of course, Charlotte here. And what is that? And the other student here to get to know more about what is that the discourse analysis here actually. Because when we talk about discourse analysis, sometimes it's really what is that? Some things like it's kind of different with the English education. Because our study program is English education. Mostly we are talking about the method of teaching, the way to make a lesson plan, the way of methodology or something. But when we talk about like pragmatic and then discourse knowledge, it is something like, oh, it's really challenging. So that's right. Maybe here we hope that we can have some kind of a new insight, new what's that knowledge from Dr. Charlotte here. And today before we go any further, let me introduce myself. Charlotte, I have already got some experience having an email with you, a lot of email that I have already shared. You send me, I send you. My name is Suharyanto. Usually my students, my partner, my colleagues here, they call me with Harry, or my students call me Mr. Harry, since I am one of the the teacher here, and I become the secretary of the study program. So that's why I was in charge of this visiting professor program. Like what I told you before, here in our study program, we always invited some foreign lecturer, especially from the English-speaking country, such as in this semester we invited from Nanyang University, Singapore, and then from Otago University, New Zealand, Monash University, Australia, and the last one. You are here as your schedule here is the last before we close this semester. From the we invite here Dr. Charlotte Taylor from Sussex University, right? And yeah, it's really we are really happy for having you here. We hope that our students here not only just learning from our internal lecturer here, because yeah, the curriculum, the material that we share every year, we get this kind of material. However, from this opportunity, I hope that we are going to have the new insight, new knowledge from the broadened understanding, not only from Indonesian context, but also from the, maybe you can share with us some European or English context that would be very good for us for improving our knowledge in discourse analysis. Okay, now without any further ado, maybe I would like to give the time for Dr. Taylor, or I can call you Charlotte here, for for presenting the material for today. Please, this time is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. So I can't share yet. I've got a message saying that it's disabled.
Okay, wait a minute. Let me make you co-host. I'm sorry. I think I make a mistake for forgetting making you a co-host. Let me make you a co-host now.
Thank you.
Okay, you are already the co-host now.
Perfect.
I think you're good, right?
Yes. Thank you very much. So if you could just be patient with me one moment while I just set that up, that would be great.
Yes.
That's it. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see you. We can get
Okay.
presentation here.
So I've prepared, as we discussed, a series of 3 talk sessions for starting to think about discourse in the way that I think about discourse.
Yes.
And I think what's really important here to think about is the fact that there are many different ways of thinking about discourse. There are many different approaches, many different aspects. So I'm hoping this will complement what you've already been doing with your lecturers. But, you know, be aware there are many different ideas about what discourse is and how people approach it. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about who I am, so you know who you're talking to. So I work in corpus linguistics, which is when we use very large bodies of data to try and understand patterns of language use. I work in discourse analysis, and I work in pragmatics. And as we've already heard, pragmatics and discourse analysis, they go together, right? They're very closely connected. So in the books that I've published in the area, I've published on politeness, for instance, within that context of pragmatics. I've published on corpus linguistics a lot, and I've published on persuasion. And persuasion is really about discourse analysis. I'm interested in how people communicate, how they persuade other people, how they present their ideas, how they encourage other people to agree with those ideas. And so a lot of work I've done has been in political discourse, because that's an area that's very important for persuasion, right? Politics is all about trying to get people to agree with your ideas and with your agenda. And the last area that I would say I'm particularly interested in is about silence and absence in discourse, and how what's important is what we don't say as well as what we do say, the topics that maybe we feel we're not allowed to talk about, the topics we feel we shouldn't talk about, or the topics that we think we could talk about, but nobody does, right? So there's this whole range of things that I'm interested in relation to discourse, how we use language, and how we try to persuade people of things. And what I'm going to try and do for this session is start off today thinking about an introduction to what I mean about discourse, and thinking in particular about social actors. And by social actors, I mean people or groups or organizations. I mean the people who are presented and how they're presented. In the second session, I want to talk about actions. So here we might think about a topic commonly referred to as transitivity, which might be a term that you've heard before. But here we're really thinking about the processes, the kinds of verbs that are associated with particular people, particular actors. And at the moment, I was planning for the last session to talk about metaphor, because I love metaphor. It's a fantastic and fascinating area. But if you want some changes that we talk more about your student projects, then we can change that for that last session if you prefer. So today, introduction then, what do I mean by discourse, and how do we find the people who are being talked about in discourse? So I'm going to start with some definitions, because as your teacher, your lecturer's already said, there's really key concepts that you need to know about before we can start to talk about discourse. The first, of course, is what we mean by discourse. So different people will use different definitions, and that's totally normal because there are many different approaches. So this is my understanding of discourse. So I'm going to say a discourse refers to a set of meanings, metaphors, representations, images, stories, statements, and so on, that in some way together produce a particular version of events. It refers to a particular picture that is painted of an event, person, or class of person, a particular way of representing it in a certain light. So I really like this definition because of this metaphor, actually, that it's using about a discourse being a painting. It's a representation of reality. So a discourse is a way of representing, of constructing something in our reality. The second point that Burr makes in this definition is that surrounding any one object, event, person, etc., there may be a variety of different discourses, each with a different story to tell about the object in question and a different way of representing it to the world. So if we think of a topic or a group of people, let's say we want to consider climate change, right? Very important social topic at the moment. If we consider climate change, there will be different discourses, different ways of representing climate change. And those different ways will depend on people's ideas about what it is. So you have a single object, but you have many different discourses around the object. The third point that Burr makes is that each discourse brings different aspects into focus, raises different issues for consideration, and has different implications for what we should do. And I really like this last point. This last point is so important because it's not just that a discourse is a representation and a picture and that's it. It finishes there. No, the point is it gives us a different picture, and that picture changes how we think about the topic and therefore changes what we think we should do about the topic. So it affects our attitudes, which in turn affects our actions. So 3 really key things about discourse there. So discourse is one possible representation of a topic. There will be many representations, and it has an impact. It has an impact on our attitudes and our actions. So this is what I think of as discourse. And critical discourse analysis is one of many approaches to discourse analysis. And critical discourse analysis is particularly interested in the relationship between language and society. And that's why you've got that diagram right there. And so the point that critical discourse analysts typically want to make is that language reflects society. So if we look at the language from a particular society or a particular culture, we can understand something about the society and the values of the society. But it's also true that the language helps change the society, right? So if we always talk about a particular group of people in a very particular way, that will have an impact on our attitudes and actions, and therefore in turn will change society in some way. So that's getting to that last point of the previous slide, right? That discourse isn't just a picture, a reflection, a mirror. It's something that helps shape and change society as well. So this is expanded more in this citation from Fairclough, from Vodak, 2 really key authors within critical discourse analysis. So they say critical discourse analysis sees discourse, language use in speech and writing, as a form of social practice. And social practice means a thing that we do in society, really. So critical discourse analysis sees discourse, language use in speech and writing, as a form of social practice. Describing discourse as a social practice implies a dialectical relationship between a particular discursive event and situations, institutions, and social structures which frame it, right? This is what your lecturer was saying about context and how important context is. The discursive event is shaped by them, but it also shapes them. That is, discourse is socially constitutive as well as socially conditioned. It constitutes situations, objects of knowledge, and social identities of and relationships between people and groups of people. So the key point here then is that when we talk about analysing discourse, we're thinking about analysing the relationship between language and society, and we're really focusing on this being a relationship that goes in 2 directions. Language affects, changes society, and language reflects society at the same time. And so when we analyse language within a critical discourse analytic framework, what we're often looking at is representation. Remember, representation was a key aspect of that citation we had right at the beginning. So representation is the way in which language is reflecting and construing society in some way. So I want to start with these 2 citations, which I think are really helpful for understanding what we're doing when we analyse language in discourse analysis. So the first one is Machin, who says, in any language, there exists no neutral way to represent a person. All choices will serve to draw attention to certain aspects of identity that will be associated with certain aspects of discourse. So this is an important point, right? That no neutral way to represent a person. So when we look at like this critical discourse analytic perspective, we assume that every term that's used, every bit of language has some kind of meaning about the opinion that's being offered of the people who are being described. So let's just stay with that first one for one moment, because I want to focus on identity just for a moment. So identity is often discussed in connection with discourse and representation because, as Machin has just shown us, when we use language to represent people, we are drawing attention to aspects of their identity. So identity is something that's been very extensively discussed and theorized. And Buchholz and Hall say identity is the social positioning of self and other, right? Me and people who I think of as not being like me in some way. And that's how I construct my identity. You construct your identity with reference to other people, with reference to people who you think are similar to you. Oh, we have the same social identity. And with reference to people who you think are different from you. Oh, I'm not like those people, right? You maintain a distance from those people. And so theorists from social psychology, for instance, have often talked about the idea of the in-group and the out-group. So the in-group are people who you think of as being within your social group, and out-group people outside your social group.
Huh?
Is it okay?
No, it's okay. You may go on.
Okay, sorry, I thought there was a... So when we're thinking then about the in-group and the out-group, these are not fixed categories. You will have different in-groups and different out-groups in different contexts, right? So now we can think we have a shared in-group of academics. We are all participants in the university environment, and so we all have something in common, and we are part of the same group. In a different context, your in-group will be different people. It might be people who like a particular football team, and you're the in-group, and people who support another football team are the out-group. It might be related to music. If music is important to your social identity, that you like a particular genre of music, and therefore you feel you have an in-group identity with people who like the same music, and there's an out-group identity for people who like a very different type of music, perhaps. And so Teichfeld talks about this in terms of how our social identity might be performed through 3 stages of social categorization, excuse me, social categorization, which is where you identify different groups in society. So as we said, that could be related to something as banal as music. I like this music, there are people who like this other music, and I can categorize people based on their musical preferences. Maybe when I look at those people, I can see from the bags that they're carrying or the t-shirt that they're wearing, how they are identifying with those particular genres of music. There might be a style of clothing that's associated with a particular genre, for instance. So you could have a social categorization. You identify, you see there are different categories in society. And then a process of social identification where you say, I think I'm part of this category. I am really not part of this other category. And then social comparison would be the stage where you start to think, oh, this category is better than this category, or this category is different from this other category in some way. And so these processes obviously are not conscious. They're not things we realize we're doing, but they're part of how we position ourselves in society. And so I'm talking about identity because identity is going to be important for thinking about representation, which is important for thinking about discourse. So we have in-group, people we identify with, and out-group, people we consider not part of our social identity. Okay, so then we could think about what kinds of words might be associated with the in-group and the out-group. So the most famous example that people always cite would be, for instance, if you see, or if you want to refer to, if you want to represent a person who fights. And a person who fights in a war, for instance, could be seen very differently from different perspectives. So you might consider somebody who is fighting to be a hero. You might label them as a freedom fighter. But if you are negatively affected by that person, if you disagree with that person and their values, you might call them a terrorist, right? And so there are certain words that we never use to describe the in-group. Nobody would ever say, I am a terrorist, because they would use a word that reflects their view, that they think they're doing something legitimate and good, for instance. But it's not just major things like war that we're talking about, where we have in-group and out-group words, or words that we would use for ourselves and not for other people. If you look at the cartoon on the right, we've got somebody hugging somebody else, in this case, a bear and a bunny. So from the bear's perspective, This could be friendly and kind. And from the bunny's perspective, this could be really uncomfortable and too much, right? And I'm sure you've all had that situation where sometimes you're talking to somebody, right? And this is normal and you're talking and they come very close to you when they're talking and they think maybe they're being friendly and you keep going backwards and backwards because you feel they're too close, for instance. So we have different perspectives on things and we have different words to represent the same circumstance. And there are some words which we only use for ourselves, probably as we will never use for ourselves because they're always kind of othering words, which is going to be an important context to think about. So what we want to think about then is the ways in which these terms that we use are representing our identity. So there's a longer citation here from Celia Ben Habib, who says, every search for identity includes differentiating oneself from what one is not. So it's this idea that when you do a kind of social categorization, social identification, you're saying, I'm kind of like this, I am not like this. So identity politics is always and necessarily a politics of the creation of difference. And they were talking about a particular European context. So they go on to say, one is, in other words, identifies as a Bosnian Serb to the degree to which one is not a Bosnian Muslim or a Croat. What is shocking about these developments is not the inevitable dialectic of identity difference they display, but rather the atavistic belief that identities can be maintained and secured only by eliminating difference and otherness. And this is the key point. The negotiation of identity difference is the political problem facing democracies on a global scale. In other words, what they're saying is that if you have a sense of identity which is based on I am this and I am not that, okay, then what you have is an issue of difference, an issue of othering, you have a lack of harmony in a society. And so this is why discourse matters. We need to be able to identify and understand what's happening when we have this kind of politics of difference, this identification through difference. So we were focusing there on that first quote from Machin, who was saying that in any language, there exists no neutral way to represent a person. And now I want to think about that second citation, which is from Fowler, who says something similar in he's emphasizing that there are always different ways of saying the same thing, and they are not accidental alternatives. Differences in expression carry ideological distinction, and thus differences in representation. So there's always different ways of saying the same thing. So these 2 points go together, right? Machin says there's no neutral way to represent a person, and Fowler says there are always different ways. And it's because there are always different ways, because there are always alternatives, that there's no neutral way. Every way that we choose carries with it some kind of meaning. And in this case, Fowler is really focusing on ideological meaning. So maybe this is something else we should clarify as a key concept. What do we mean when we say ideology? And again, there might be different ideas about ideology depending on somebody's perspective on this. So I'm going to say for me, ideologies are a set of ideas, values, and views that are shared by a group of people. So it's a similar way of thinking, a similar way of understanding the world. From a critical discourse analytic perspective, so if you're doing critical discourse analysis, all texts are ideological. And this is an important point because sometimes people use ideology as a criticism and say, oh, I don't like this, it's too ideological. From the critical discourse analytic perspective, when we're being analysts, when we're being scholars, everything is ideological because, as we saw with Machin, there is no neutral way. Everything carries some kind of view. Critical discourse analysts are particularly interested in naturalization, and this is something we'll come back to later. And naturalization is the process by which certain ideologies become accepted as common sense. And this is something that generally becomes evident when we start looking at, for instance, cross-cultural studies. And then you can see that something that is accepted as normal and common sense in one culture is not the same thing in another culture. And then you can say, oh, okay, this is a construct. This isn't obvious and common sense. It's, as a society, as a culture, we've constructed it as being common sense. So Fairclough says, because naturalization is a powerful way of making an ideology, a belief, seem normal, part of the task of a critical discourse analyst is to denaturalize ideologies. So to identify the ideology and show that it is one of many possible ways of representing that phenomenon, that reality. And so on that, Hart says language is ideological when it is used to promote one perspective over another. So when representation comes in. He goes on, grammars as system and gender ideology, through the often inhibited choices, they allow for representing the same material in different ways. So you can see how this is all tying together, right? Discourse is about representing some phenomenon, and the way that it's done is by making choices, and all those choices carry meaning. In other words, all those choices are ideological in some way. Okay. So key points then, there's no neutral way of doing representation, and the choices that we make carry ideological significance. So this is kind of our foundation, our baseline for thinking about language in a critical discourse analytic perspective. And so if we focus in particular on names, on the words that are used to talk about people, you can see there's often public debate about the names that are used because we know they carry meaning. So some years ago, Al Jazeera declared that when it was talking about the refugee crisis in and around Europe, they said they would no longer use the word migrants. That's why it's in inverted commas. They're talking about this. And they said the word migrant has become a largely inaccurate umbrella term for this complex story. So they were trying to draw attention to the problem with naming, and they were trying to say they were going to look for different names that could be used. So what I thought we would try here, and this might be easier than I expected because there's just 40 of us here, is I thought you could try and think of a set of names for the same phenomenon. So what I would like you to do in a moment is to think of different ways of saying the same thing. So we're going to stay with that topic established with Al Jazeera, thinking about migrants. And we're going to say, what names can you think of to describe people who move from one area to another area? And you could be thinking or commenting, are these terms which would be in-group terms? Would I use this to describe myself? Or are they out-group terms, terms that we only use to describe other people who maybe we don't agree with? And we could also think about what aspects of identity they foreground. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to put a link in the chat, and you can tell me, please, if the link works, because I tried it before and it was fine, but that doesn't mean it will continue to be fine. This is something I know about online teaching. So there's a link in the chat. Could everybody try and click on the link and see if it opens? It works. Thank you very much, Mohsin. Okay, so what I'm going to do next, if this is okay with your teachers, can I do this? Or maybe you're going to have to do this for me. No, maybe I can do it. I'm going to assign you to a breakout room for about 4 minutes, very short time, so that you can talk to your friends and your colleagues for some ideas. And as you're talking, just type in all of the names you can think of onto that Padlet, the thing that opened in the link. It's anonymous. Nobody knows what you put in, okay? It's just so I can see what ideas you're coming up with. So can I check with Mr. Harry? Is this okay?
Yes, that's no
Great.
problem, Charlotte. You can do that. Or maybe
Perfect.
you need some help to make the groups in...
I'm happy doing the rooms, so I'm going to do
Okay.
5 rooms.
Okay.
You will get an invitation as a student. Could you please go to your room? And so it'll just be like 4 minutes, and then put all the ideas you can think of for describing people who move on the Padlet. if you need help, ask us for help, okay? Otherwise,
Okay.
please just accept the invitation and go into the room. Is that okay?
Okay, I think so, right, students?
So you should have an invitation now, and you can click on the invitation to join the room. Yeah, starting
Okay,
to work.
everybody, please, you may right now join the room and then discuss with your partners or groups the question that was shared by Charlotte in the slide, right? Okay, Laila and the others joining with the others. Okay. Okay, Charlotte, how many minutes do we have?
All right, I'm going to call everybody back now. I was just waiting so I see
Okay.
some more was still popping up on there.
Yes, no problem. I think some students still have what is that? Writing something in the Padlet.
Yeah,
Read
so
and
maybe we'll
write
give
it.
it another minute to let them finish writing because I see it's all coming in now.
Yes, no problems. Ayo adik-adik yang belum ya, segera diisi Padletnya. Please everyone who haven't write anything in the Padlet, you may check on the chat box. Charlotte has already shared it to you, so I hope that everyone's have no problem with the technical term there. Berapa nih? Duh, kok pada balik? Ini.
Okay, so I think I'm going to stop it there. It seems to have slowed down now. So I'm going to close the rooms. Waiting for everybody to come back in. That should be done within the next few seconds.
Where are the others?
Okay, so I see the rooms are closing. And I think everybody's back apart from a couple of people who seem to still be in the rooms. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so first of all, then, thank you very much for filling that in and populating it with all of those ideas. So I hope you can see on your screen the list of ideas that you've put up. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see that, Charlotte.
Great. Okay. So you can see there's lots of different alternatives then for talking about people who move. And I love the ones you've got here. So you've got ideas that are to do with sort of temporary movement versus more permanent movement. So there's things like traveller, for instance, could be somebody who's passing through, or it could be a much longer journey. I like these ones about wanderers and roamers and this idea of traveling around different spaces, perhaps without an intention of permanence. And then we've got words like explorer. Explorer is a really great one because that might be about permanence. A lot of sort of colonization was represented as exploration, right? But it could also be something similar to traveling. And then we've got some quite familiar things like immigration. We've got things which refer to very specific legal status like refugee and asylum seeker. And we've got, what else have we got? Expatriate, which is a super interesting one, because expatriate is very much a kind of self-describing term, right? That people present themselves in those terms, seeing themselves as different from perhaps other groups of migrants. So we've got loads there to think about. And I think that just really illustrates so effectively that we have different ways of representing the same thing, movement of people. As somebody else has put up there, alive people. That's what people do. Pilgrim is a great one as well. So sort of highlighting a religious identity of the people who are involved. Yeah, thank you for that one. So there's many different ways of representing it, and the different ways will highlight different aspects of their identity. So I'm just going to go back to the slideshow now. I hope you can see that. And so we've seen, if we just take one single group of people, all people, pretty much, people who move, we could name them in different ways, and this would highlight different aspects of their identity. This is an example of terms that some British students gave me when I asked them to do a similar kind of task. So they come up with some very similar things to what you've got, and also some different ones. For instance, they've got words which are used in other languages, for instance, as well, like giri, or giri. And then we've also got things which refer to highlight particular aspects of identity in terms of ethnic identity, for instance, like gypsies, and then quite technical legal terms like alien as well. So all of these words refer to the same phenomenon, but you can see they're highlighting different aspects of identity, and they convey some kind of ideology. Okay. So what I want to say then is I'd like you to take away 3 ideas, and I'm going to take these one at a time. The 3 main points really are that names are not neutral. So this is what Machin was saying, and we want us to explore that a little bit more. And the meaning comes from the use. So the meaning isn't something that exists in an abstract way. The meaning comes from how we use it. So if we go back to Fowler, who was kind of one of the founders of critical linguistics, he re-emphasizes this, saying critical linguistics insists that all representation is mediated. It challenges common sense by pointing out that something could have been represented some other way with a very different significance. This is not, in fact, simply a question of distortion or bias. There's not necessarily any true reality that can be unveiled by critical practice. There are simply relatively varying representations. So what we want to say here is that there are always different ways of saying the same thing. They all convey different ideologies. And it's not that one is necessarily true and one is biased in some way. They're all ideological. So of course you can have things that are true and not true. That's a different discussion. This discussion is about you can have different names, and the different names convey different opinions. Okay, and it's not necessarily the case that there is something that is central in some way, that the right term to use. They just all convey in different attitudes towards it. So let's stay with this idea then. Names are not neutral, and meaning comes from use. So one of the ways we can think about this from a very linguistic perspective is through the idea of collocation, which you've probably come across before when you've talked about language, and for instance, think about cohesion as well. So from a linguistic perspective, we can say that collocation is about words which go together. And Firth says, you shall know a word by the company it keeps. That seems a kind of strange thing to say. You know, we would think, well, I can know a word by looking it up in the dictionary. But actually, what the dictionary will tell us is how the word is used. And so another way we can find out about how a word is used is by looking at the collocations, the words that go together with a particular word. So Firth said, for instance, one of the meanings of night is its collocability with dark, that dark and night will often go together. That's not very significant for thinking about ideology, right? But what if we think about terms used for people who move, which is a politically sensitive topic? So we could say one of the meanings of the word immigrant in British public discourse is its collocability with, and here we could look at, well, what words go together with immigrant, for instance. So let's have a look. So this is a summary from a corpus linguistics output where we look at the words that go together with the words in the top bar there. So this is looking at UK, at British newspapers. So if you look at the word in the centre, immigrants, words that go together with immigrants in British public discourse in the newspapers include illegal. So illegal is very often used as a pre-modifier for immigrants. So the newspapers talk about illegal immigrants, for instance. And so illegal becomes part of the kind of social meaning of immigrants. I'm not saying that means immigrants are illegal. What I'm saying is they're represented as being illegal. And so it might change how you think about that word. Other words will have different sets of collocates, and therefore different sets of associations. So, for instance, if we look at the word refugees in that first column, you can see there are references to places and there's references to processes like resettle. And if you look at migrants in the last column, you can see there's references to places like Mediterranean, and it's also quite a it emphasizes the problems that those people might encounter. So we've got drowned as a collocate, rescued, people need help, stranded, and so on. So we can say that the meaning comes from the use, and we can find out about the meaning by looking at the use, by looking at the collocations, for instance. So the names are not neutral and the meaning comes from use. This is the first point I wanted you to take away. The second point then is that names are choices. So this point we've already said, but I really want to emphasize it because it's totally central to discourse analysis. So names are choices. And so we've just seen there are many different choices we could use for describing people who move, right? Some of those will focus on particular aspects of identity, like pilgrim. Some will lead us to a more negative representation, like immigrant, because it often goes together with illegal. But we could also think about terms that are not used. So I did a very long historical study looking at terms which are used to represent people who move over a 200-year period. And there's two terms which become very frequent in time and then disappear. They're not used now in contemporary British discourse. And one of these words is evacuees. So evacuee, if you look it up in a dictionary, will probably say something like an evacuee is a person who has to be taken away from their home, place, or country, city, because it's in danger, and therefore they have to be helped to move away. So this would seem like a word which would be very appropriate for describing refugees, for instance, right? But it's not used. It's not used in present day British discourse. It peaked in the 1940s, then it kind of disappeared. So let's think what's happening if we look at the collocates, the words that go together with refugees, for instance. Well, what you see is if you look at the yellow, they get it often being used to refer to children. So this tells us this is a name which conveys some sympathy, probably, because nobody ever thinks of children as being responsible for their own problems. So we've got an emphasis on children. But then you can also see that from 1970 onwards, those blue-grey marks, it refers to war. And what happens is you have this word evacuee, which could be used to refer to people who have to leave their hometown, their city, their country, because they're in danger. Really just becomes used in a very narrow way to talk about people who moved in the past. It's being used to talk about war movement in the 1940s, basically. So it's been historicized. It's not being used to talk about contemporary movement at all. So the names are choices. We could use that word. We don't use that word. If we use that word, we would express a more sympathetic stance. The third point then is that names construct categories. So I'm going to stay with migration because that gives us a handle on this. And you could look at these two headlines from different newspapers. So here we've got at the top, the Washington Times says caravan, mostly standard illegal immigrants, not refugees fleeing violence. So here the newspaper's creating two categories with two different names, right? One category is illegal immigrants, and another category is refugees fleeing violence. So they're being categorized as two different groups. If you look at the second headline, we've got something similar. Macron, so that the French president says EU must share refugees and expel economic migrants. So here we've got two groups, refugees and economic migrants, right? And so there's an emphasis on the economic migrants being negatively evaluated. They should be expelled, sent out in some way, whereas the refugees, it's more positive, it's been saying they should stay and be shared in those countries. So we've got categorization through the names. The names create these categories. They don't exist in any natural way. They're created by the discourse. So what we have with this kind of binary categorization is that you have a group of people who have something in common, people who move, and they're divided into two. So one gets a name like refugee, and that group is presented as being good, deserving, people we should help. The other group gets a different name. They're labeled as migrants, and they're classified in some way in these instances I'm talking about, not in general. They're classified as being undeserving, as being bad in some kind of way. So here we've got the reference to illegal immigrants, note that collocation of illegal and immigrant, and we've got refugees fleeing violence, so they need help. So this binary categorization, you take people who have something in common, divide them into those who are good and those who are bad. And then a common rhetorical strategy with that is then you get this move from another headline here from The Guardian, where in order to protect the good ones, you need to actually attack the bad ones in some way. So here we've got The Guardian headline says, to help real refugees, be firm with economic migrants. So these two groups are categorized as being different. They're placed in opposition, and it's suggesting that you should be firm, so be somehow critical with the economic migrants in order to help the refugees. So this is a very common strategy. Sorry, I'm just going to go up a second. So this was the key point then that we want to say. So names are not neutral, names are choices, there's always alternatives, and names construct categories. So if we move into thinking about kind of the practicalities of discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis, one way that you could analyze these naming choices, if you wanted to, would be to use social actor analysis. So this is a very detailed kind of typology classification system that was devised by Van Leeuwen. And I'm just going to give you a few examples from this, so you could think about, oh, could I use this for analyzing my own data? So the first point that we have in Van Leeuwen's system is thinking about exclusion versus inclusion. And so here what we're essentially asking is who is present in the text, inclusion, and who is absent in the text, exclusion. So here I'm going to take a different example, moving away from migration for the moment. So if we think about newspapers reporting on a war, we might say, well, which social actors, which groups of people would we expect to be present in the reporting? So war. So presumably we're thinking there are going to be a minimum of 2 social actors because there's 2 groups fighting together. So a long time ago, I did a study with a colleague looking at the newspaper reporting in the UK of the war in Iraq, which obviously was a very big global topic at the time. And we thought, well, let's find out who is being represented, who are the main social actors. So we built a corpus, a very large database of all of the newspaper articles about the Iraq war. And we thought, well, let's look at some verbs which we expect to be transitive, right? So we look at fight, or say, who is fighting who? What's going on? Well, what we found was not what you might expect, in fact, because we found lots of patterns like this. So if you do not fight the war, you'll not control the peace. So here we've got one social actor, you, but who are they fighting? I don't know. The war, what does that mean? The second one, today we can see the consequences of fighting a war in our sitting rooms. no social actors are named here at all. The third one, the Pentagon has proved itself great at fighting wars, but not very good at dealing with their aftermath. So here we've got one social actor, the Pentagon. And then the fourth one, it's easier for Saddam to fight this war, one social actor. So what you have a verb which looks like it would be a transitive verb telling you about two social actors. And in fact, all the time we get this pattern of fight a war, not fight a country, an army, a group of people in some way. So here we had an absence, right? Who was not in the discourse was who was being fought. And if we look at another verb, which unfortunately is very prominent in media reporting of war, the verb to die, what we find is that, again, there's a pattern of absence, but a different type of absence. So we looked at all of the occurrences of die in the newspapers, and then we categorized who was being described as having died. And you can see in that pie chart that it was essentially reporting on coalition soldiers or journalists. And there's a tiny, tiny little sliver at the top, which was talking about Iraqi soldiers dying. So they were not considered to be newsworthy in the reporting. They were absent from the reporting. And of course, what this tells us is that there's a pattern of trying to reduce the focus on the death of others and a focus on the death of the in-group. So in-group, out-group representations are differing there. So we've seen how you can have exclusion. Who was excluded in that reporting was who was being fought in all kinds of ways. And then we could have inclusion. And within inclusion, we could look at a whole range of different things. So we might have personalization, or we might have impersonalization. So with personalization, people are described as individuals, for instance. And with impersonalization, they might be described in ways which don't emphasize their human nature, or in ways in which people are collectivized. They're all sort of grouped together, so they lose that individual sense. Okay, so here's two examples from British newspapers where they were both talking actually about the same topic. They were talking about people who are on benefits. And what that means, to be on benefits in the UK context, means people who receive money from the state because they can't work and earn money. So that's all it's talking about. It's talking about people who receive help from the state in the form of money. So if we look at the first one, The Guardian says, I am on incapacity benefits and I am scared. Multiple organ failure left me disabled, but I'm afraid that the government's plans to slash the welfare bill, coupled with efficiency savings at my council, could leave me with no support. So here there's a whole series of references to social actors, which are self-references. We've got I, me, I, my, me. A lot of personalization, right? A lot of first-person pronouns in there. And the other is just mentioned as the government. Okay, so the government obviously depersonalizes, collectivizes, it's seen as a single institution, not people in an institution. If we look at the other example that we've got, it says a sink estate in Rochdale has the worst record in the country. A staggering 84% of working age residents in the central and Fallinge area are on benefits. So here we've got a reference to people, but they're described in numerical terms, 84% of working age residents. So this is very different from the example on your left. In the example on your left, it's highly personalized. The individual gets to tell their own story with those first person pronouns. In the example on the left, talking about the same topic, it's totally depersonalized. They are numbers in a system. Okay, so this is what we mean when we talk about the personalization versus depersonalization. Are people shown as individuals? Do they speak with a personal experience, or are they used in a kind of statistical way? So this is one thing we could think about. Another thing we could think about is when people are named, for instance, how formal are the names that are used? And you saw even in this session, right, we established at the beginning of the session what our names should be for talking to each other, right? So somebody might say, no, I want to be called Dr. Taylor, or I might say I'd like to be called Charlotte. And there's a difference of formality there, and it's a choice, the name that is used. So if we take a famous individual and a famous event, we can look at how the different names might be used. So what you've got here is a whole series of front pages from when the British Queen died, right? So what I want you to do just for a moment is to look at all those front pages. I think the first one's not very clear, but don't worry. Look at the front pages. How is this individual being named, or in fact, not being named? So take a moment just to look at those. Okay. So which newspaper, you can put the answer in the chat if you want. Which newspaper is the odd one out? Which is the newspaper which, in fact, did not even talk about the Queen? Where do we have exclusion?
Which one? The other? Everyone, maybe you may have the answer. Oh, the internet is.
Hello, Miss Taylor. Hello, Miss Taylor.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry, the internet is unstable. Maybe some of my students have also experienced this. Okay. I have once, a few years ago, one of my students was conducting a research paper of the last of their duty, that is about multinational war. Newspaper, the headline news on about multinational war, and then she did this within the collocation, finding the word showing that there is die, kill, murder. So she is identifying the percentage of collocated words about the death and then uncollocated word. So maybe Miss Taylor can tell to my student now the function of doing observation or research on collocation. Besides, we are able to express our skill speaking or writing about some facts in society. So what are the more valuable things doing collocation? Because only a few students interested in this choice of topics about collocation. Thank you, Miss Taylor.
Sure. I mean, collocation is super important. I mean, really, it's if you have an idea of language, that the meaning in language comes from language use, then the only way you can find out about contemporary use, like right now, is to look at collocation. Because if you go and look for meaning in a dictionary, you find what people identified as the meaning a few years ago when they wrote the dictionary. So collocation is quite revolutionary, actually, because it allows you to see, like, now, what are the associations that particular word has now in this contemporary moment in time? So I would really encourage people to do work on collocations. Having said that, I think it's very difficult to do work on collocations without also doing corpus linguistics, because you need to be able to identify in your text many occurrences. Although I had a worksheet I was going to use with you where you could do it in a more manual kind of way and see what those collocations are. But yeah, I would definitely encourage your students to be looking at collocation. So is the internet stable now? Can we continue? Or are we going to have people not able to participate?
Okay, we can continue, by the way, Charlotte. We still have
Is it
about,
stable again?
yes, but we still have maybe about 20 minutes to go. Maybe
Yeah.
if you can manage the time for question, or maybe that would be great. That would be okay.
Okay, so the question about these headlines was then thinking about representation, and we're thinking about naming choices. So we said the first thing to think about for naming choices is who is named and who is not named, who is included, which social actors are present and which social actors are absent. So if you look at these series of front pages, all from the same time period, there's one which is the odd one out. There's one of the front pages does not talk about the Queen at all, in fact. So the third one along, Morning Star is the name of the paper, says Truss's energy boon, is talking about the Prime Minister, right? So why? What can we infer from seeing absence here? And the point about this would be that this particular newspaper is a communist newspaper. So they don't want to feature the Queen. They don't agree with the Queen. They don't think anybody should talk about the Queen, right? So absence tells us about ideology as well as presence. And then we were saying that when we do these naming choices, we can also think about formality, for instance. So one of these newspapers is much more informal than the others in the name they choose to refer to the Queen. Can you see one which seems to be more informal? And if so, can you put it in the chat?
Okay, Ms. Taylor, I'm sorry, there is my student want to ask you. Maybe she is ashamed. Mbak Ningrum, please, about inside and outside fact study. The difference inside and outside things. Mbak Ningrum, Amelia, Mela, silakan. Amel. Oh, where are they?
Okay.
Hello, Amel, Ningrum, silakan, please. Ask her about the Mbak Amel. Oh,
Okay.
Mohsin, you have something to ask? Mohsin.
Not yet, ma'am.
Not yet. I think maybe we can continue first, Gulaila, about the question from Charlotte.
Yeah, continue tomorrow.
No, I mean,
Amel, tadi Ningrum. Tadi in our discussion with 5 students, they are still getting difficulty and getting the idea and differentiating about inside and outside facts. Your presentation, Charlotte, your presentation before this.
About the difference between insider and outsider group.
Yeah.
So really, when we're talking about the insider groups, talking about groups with which you identify that you see yourself as a member of that group, and outsider groups, those which you consider to be outside of you, which you are not a part of. And those groups will be different at different moments in time, who you consider to be your inside group and who you consider to be your outside.
Your slide doesn't move, sorry. I
can't hear.
Oh. Maybe what Gulaila means that she needs also.
Yeah, the previous slide.
She wants to listen your explanation together with watching the slide. I mean.
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe.
No, again.
This one?
Yang itu Gulaila? Which one, Gulaila?
Ningrum, which one, Ningrum? Yeah, ini, yes. In group or out group words.
So the in-group
example.
words,
yeah.
In-group words would be words that you would use to describe your own group. And outgroup words would be words you only use to describe other people. So the most obvious example would be a word like terrorist. Nobody ever self-identifies as a terrorist. Nobody ever says, I am a terrorist, right? This is a word we use as an outgroup word to describe people who we consider to be morally wrong, essentially, right? If you're fighting, you wouldn't say, I'm a terrorist. You might say, I am a freedom fighter. And so the same way that terrorist only used as an outgroup word, freedom fighter is only used as an in-group word. Nobody would ever say, I really disagree with those freedom fighters, because you wouldn't say freedom fighter if you thought that they were wrong and they shouldn't be fighting. It gives a positive evaluation, so you're only going to use it to describe your in-group in some sense, not your out-group. And so we could have many different things that we would use to describe ourselves, and these are words that we wouldn't use to describe other people. So some words might be more seemingly neutral. So I might say, I'm a woman, right? And I'll say, other people are also women. And that wouldn't be particularly marked in any way. However, there might be terms that we would only use to describe ourselves and terms we only use to describe others. I mean, the classic ones that people also talk about are things like something like stubborn. Stubborn has quite negative connotations, right? So if you're talking about yourself, you might say, I'm focused.
Oh, that's
or
fun.
I'm strong-minded.
Oh,
But you might not say stubborn, because stubborn suggests that you don't change your mind when you should change your mind.
Okay, Bu Laila, is that understandable, the explanation from Charlotte?
Okay, I'm still stuck on my students' problem. Suppose that the text is the text, not like this one, not the event, not the context. So that, for example, a sentence text article in the article. Is it similar to the idea in differentiating between cohesion and coherence? Because whenever we found coherence, we should find other context outside the text. So to understand about the text, how would you relate, this term, with the available theory of and grammar cohesion and coherent? We use the theory or the term from Halliday, cohesion in English.
I mean, I don't think there's any link with cohesion. The link with coherence would be, yes, context, absolutely. In that the in-group and out-group words exist because there are contexts of use. And sometimes you can only see that a word has a particular status as an in-group or an out-group word when you look at the context in which it's used. And that's where we come back to collocation, actually, because collocation tells us about cotext and context. So to take an example of a word which might look more neutral, it's not so obvious as like terrorist. We take the word community. Community seems like a good word, right? It seems like quite a positive word for describing groups of people. But actually, when you look at community as it's used in British migration discourses, it's always othering. There's no reference to, for instance, the British community or our community. It's never including the speaker. It's never an in-group word. It's actually always talking about other marginalized groups of people. But that's what you find out from looking at the context of when it's used. So you might have an idea, an intuition about a word like community, where you think this is a really warm, positive word. But actually, when you look at the context through the lens, for instance, of collocation, no, actually, it's used in an othering way. It's describing other people.
Okay, my student, please ask her about something you still don't understand or don't know yet. Mohsen, please. Mohsen ini the leading student in our class. Ayo, Mohsen.
Okay.
You may ask something to Miss Taylor.
Not yet, ma'am. Maybe tomorrow.
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 Okay,
We will
tomorrow,
learn-
please.
We will learn tonight about the material of discourse, and then we'll ask you, Mr. Taylor.
Okay.
Chandra, are you here?
Okay, Bulaila, before we continue for the discussion from the students, maybe I think it will be better if we just continue from what Charlotte Taylor said, or what Charles want to say, because we still have around 5 until 10 minutes. If there are still something to share with us from Charlotte, I think it will be better if you continue and finish the material for this presentation for today. Is that okay, Bulaila? And the others, okay, right? Biar diselesaikan
then
dulu ya, Bulaila
promise-
ya.
Pak Heri,
Gimana, Bu?
you will have to remind our student to promise to attend for tomorrow evening.
Of course, yes, I'm going to do that.
And then by calling the other friend.
Yes, of course, Mohsin, Chandra, and the others. I hope that tomorrow everyone is. Yeah. Okay, Charlotte, maybe you still have your time for 5 until 10 minutes before we finish this first session or our first meeting for today.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's find out where we were.
Yes, no problem.
So we were talking about nomination, right? So I said you can name people in more formal or more informal
Can you
ways.
make it bigger?
It's
Mr.
already big,
Taylor?
Bulaila.
I cannot read. It is too small.
Oh, it's full screen. I'm
It's
not
already
sure what
full
else.
screen. Yes,
I
it's
could
already full.
do.
No problem. I think it's already full screen, Bulaila. Later on, maybe we can get the
Sudah,
presentation,
sudah.
right, Charlotte? Maybe you can share to me.
So what I was trying to do is I'm trying to show you all of these front pages from
Yes.
different newspapers. And we're saying
Okay.
they're all referring to the same person, but they're
Mhm.
using different naming choices. So we can start to see that there are always choices, and the choices will carry ideological meaning.
Mhm.
If we think about formality, some of them go for very formal titles. For instance, you've got Queen Elizabeth II. So this is a full title. It's got the pre-modifier with Queen, it's specifying the number of the Queen and so on. But we've got something very different if you look at the right hand of your screen, where
Yes.
we've got what?
Granny, Granny, yes.
Yeah, so granny is grandma, right? So in this case, it's very informal. It's positioning this person not as a sovereign, not as a head of state, but in a relational way, in relation to their family. And other terms we've got are things like ma'am, so a formal title, as it being used as a vocative. And I think the other social actors we have is reference to our hearts. So not a focus on the person who died, but on the person who is being affected. So we can have a whole set of things in relation to the formality that's used, and they will tell us about the kind of relationship the speaker is trying to establish. But Van Leuven also points out we can have other names which might do categorization work. So this could be in terms of functionalization. So functionalization would be when we have a name which is used, which describes a person in terms of something that they do, some kind of function. So for instance, if you address somebody as teacher and say, oh, hi, teacher, what you're doing is you're functionalizing that person. You're not using their name like Charlotte or Dr. Taylor, which would be personalization, nomination with more formal or more informal approaches. If you say, hi, teacher, you're functionalizing them. You're describing them in terms of their function in that moment, right? But we have different social identities. So sometimes I'll be teacher and sometimes I'll be mum or something like that. So your functionalized name will change. And the choice of that tells us something about the ideology. So here we have another headline from a newspaper where it says benefit cheat claimed £13,000, whatever. So cheat is the word here that's being used to refer to a person. So the person is being described not through their name, Mr. Jones, or in a kind of aggregated way, but here it is a function. This is a person who cheats. This is a person who's not honest, who's being described. So it takes away the individuality and replaces that with some kind of function. Similarly, within that, we might have functions of identification. So people could be classified in different ways. So we saw the example before of granny instead of queen, for instance. So we could think of queen as being some sort of honorific, which does functionalization work. Whereas granny would be a relational identification. It's about what is this person in relation to other people. If you look at these headlines we've got here, the first one is taken again from thinking about people who move, migrants, and the headline is illegals have landed. So illegal, of course, is an adjective, but here it's been turned into a noun. And so what we've got here is a kind of collectivization, which also functions as some type of classification. And people are classified according to some perceived, not necessarily real, perceived legal status. So this really takes away the element of humanity, of personalization, and replaces it with a classification. In the second headline, you see another example of relational identification. It's dad. So this person isn't described as having been a doctor or having been a 38-year-old. It is dad that's used. So there's many different choices that we could use to refer to social actors, and all of those choices have meanings. So what I would suggest you try and do in preparation for tomorrow's session is a small task, right? So the key points to take away are that every name for social actors is a choice and every name conveys meaning. And so you could put this to the test through a small task. So your task would be choose a news story about an individual. It's a bit easier, probably an individual than a group of people. If you prefer group of people, go for it. But if you go for individual, it could be any type of famous individual. So it might be a politician, it might be a singer, it might be an actor, it might be a celebrity from social media. It could be somebody who's famous because of criminality. It could be somebody who's famous because they were a victim of something, but a story about one person. And then have a look at a range of different sources, from social media to news pages online to newspapers. Have a look around basically, and have a look at how different sources report that same story. So you choose one story about one individual, like the example with the Queen, and look at all the different choices that are used. See how many different ways are these people named. Are they named in more formal ways, in more informal ways? Are they classified? Are they functionalized? And then think, well, what does that actually tell me about anything? So what I'm going to suggest you do, so I can see how you get on with it, is copy the link. Well, open the link in the chat. And if you can tell me if it works, that would be great, because again, I tested it, but that doesn't mean that it will continue to work.
Yes, it works, by the way.
Great, thank you very much. So what you can do then is, in there, you can write in who you looked at, and then write all the different names that you found for that person. So not just names in the sense of Ben or Ben Jones or Mr. Jones, but all of the full range that were used. So for instance, if they were named as pop star, or if they were named as, violent criminal did X. So find the references to the person and look at the different ways they were named, and then have a think about what does that tell you about the ideology of the different places where you found those names. So that's my suggestion for you. And then if you do that, then I will have an idea for tomorrow of what you've managed to find so far and what we might need to look at. So that's my suggestion for you. I'm going to stop there because I know that you've got about 5 minutes to go, and I think that's probably where we've got to.
Yes, thank you so much, Charlotte. I think you hear some of the sound of the prayer right now behind me, right? Because this is the time we.
Right.
Yeah, that's the adhan. You know adhan, right? In the Muslim society,
absolutely.
It's time for us for having a prayer. So maybe I think I cannot continue for the activity like what I said before. Actually, we are having the time from 4 o'clock until 5:30. So hopefully for tomorrow until the next day after tomorrow, we can have the discussion more about what you have said in your slides here. Okay. And one more thing, Charlotte, maybe after this, maybe you can send me the PowerPoints for today's, and then I would like to share. I would love to help you to share it to the students and also for Ulaila as well as the lecturer in order to watch that, to make sure that all the students can have this material. Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe we can wrap it up the question answer for tomorrow, right? Because I think there will be no more time for us. We can have more question and answer session for tomorrow session. Is that okay, Bulaila and the others? Bulaila, you are still off, Bulaila. Your microphone.
Hello, Miss
Yes.
Stella.
Yeah.
Is there something to learn tonight for our students in order that they want to get involved more actively in this discussion? Like your
No, just the
task
task.
or your request or something text?
The task is already in the chat box, Bulaila. Bulaila, the task is already in the chat box. I also already send it to the group of the students, so I think there will be no problem for them. I mean, for the preparation for tomorrow's session. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Pak Eric. I haven't opened it.
Yes, I will also share it to you, Bulaila, for the what is that the task for the students.
I have written it.
Okay,
But
yes,
I have
that
not
will be
opened
okay.
it yet.
Okay, by the way, thank you so much, Charlotte, for having you for this session, for
Pleasure.
this first session. I hope that we are going to have more discussion, more new insight from you for tomorrow's session. We are going to have the same session for tomorrow at the same time, right? At the same link that I have already sent it to you via email. Okay.
Absolutely.
I think thank you so much. I think that's all for
Okay,
me.
thank
And for the
you.
others, thank you so much for today's session. I'll see you again tomorrow and see you bye-bye, by the way, Chandra.
Great.
Okay, thank you
very
adik-adik
much.
semuanya ya. I think that's all for today. Let's just
Thank
finish by
you,
saying,
Miss Stella.
Thank you so
Miss
much, by the
Stella.
way, Charlotte.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. I'll see you tomorrow, by the way. Bulaila,
Mas Mbak mahasiswa besok lebih banyak diminta ya temannya ya. Satu orang manggil 10, satu orang manggil 10. Gitu ya. Nanti yang namanya tertera di sini kan terekam di benak saya. Ini